It's shite being Scottish! With the lowest of the low! The scum of the fucking earth! The most wretched, miserable, servile...
For a long period of time, Danny Boyle's Trainspotting must have been one of my favourite films, and helped propel me into film criticism, so much so that last year I included it as a key aspect of my philosophy master's dissertation. The short critique I'm going to conduct now revolves around just a small fraction of one aspect of the film which I decided to try and rationalise along philosophic and psychoanalytic vectors. This critique primarily orbits around a Lacanian position, and with that, additionally, a Hegelian dialectic reasoning. If that all doesn't really make that much sense, don't worry about it, it unfolds as it does. Nevertheless, the cinematic arts as the channels by which these theories flow and ferment the soil make these ideas real and understandable in a concrete manner. Hopefully beyond having to open up some dense text of translated French or German. Additionally, as I'd indicated in my prior video about Rainer Brown, it's not the case that I am really reading the characters in this, as, again, none of these people have histories outside of the screen space. They're all fictional characters. All the audience has of their lives of their own history is what is presented through the audio-visual experience. With that, however, I've stalled enough, and I think we should jump into the scene in particular I am concerned with. This being the opening credits scene, in fact, within which we're introduced to Renton, Sick Boy, Spud, Tommy, Begbie, life, and the object of heroin addiction. Attending to Jacques Lacan's topographical model of the Mobius strip, which I propose mirrors a Hegelian dialectic as per his logic and phenomenology, I wish to reveal the complexity of a very simple point about Mark Renton in Danny Boyle's Trainspotting, that he contradicts himself. Lacan's theory of the divided subject is acquainted with the Hegelian assertion of truth's signal in processes of negation. Further, the primary vessel of this argument is through Renton's subjective experience of jouissance, profound life and joy, through a persistent teasing of death's own peripheries. Freudian death drive, for Lacan, is not a return to natural equilibrium dust to dust, but constitutive of an awkward non-Euclidean opposition to the pleasure principle. In other words, there is a surplus of joy in the extent to which one negates himself towards death. The opening of Trainspotting instantly takes the viewer to Renton's fleeing down Princes Street in Edinburgh, away from shop security after pilfering who knows what, whatever contributes to the full-time career of heroin addiction. Princes Street corresponds to Lacan's other, a treasure trove of signifiers. The high street carries an air of inaccessibility, whether on levels of monetary value or cultural capital. Renton interacts with this other through violence, which connotes to his own divided subjectivity, his own inner split world. Granted, before we attempt at all to effectively suture this split via contradictory geometry, let us take a good look at these two sides that spite reality, the symbolic and imaginary. Both are acquainted registers, existing interdependently through their respective antagonisms. In anticipating the awkward path these registers will take along the cinematic axis, we ought to designate where we speak in these registers. Let's tackle Renton's desire in situ with the symbolic. Princes Street may be a treasure trove, yet such treasures are bound to laws of monetary value, property, down to definitions of politeness and proprietary. Laws, so to speak. Renton resides outside, more specifically in between the symbolic agents of this law, slipping through its gaps in pilfering and taking narcotics. This violence is built upon a relation to an imaginary bodily unity, a strange ideal on the part of Renton that sits itself between the unitary gaps of the symbolic order of things, one that he sees as defendable against the inquisitions of law. We can understand this external register, the city street, political world, symbolic chain, as the outer curve of the Mobius strip. This then runs inside of itself, to the imaginary inner, the small curve. Inside, Mark Renton is what he is, in part, through the other's perception of him, more specifically, the other's desire for them. The political legal world does desire, specifically at a negative level, that of authority's perversion for the fugitive. This relationship with the external other plays out through three particular diegetic experiences as we, the audience, watch this opening scene. As we have the fast-paced visuals of Renton and Spud fleeing from security, the classic drums of Lust for Life play, the film's primary thematic score. This is contrasted by the audio layer of Renton's famous Choose Life monologue, an internalized on-screen voice whose origin lies from inside Renton's own head. Thus, we have three juxtapositional sensory experiences in these opening seconds. Again, first, there is the non-verbal resistance to the political symbolic world in the visual of Renton and Spud fleeing. Second, there is the verbal, yet completely internal monologue of choosing life. Choose a job, choose a career, choose a family, choose a fucking big television. This inner world, whose only verbal purpose is to bless the audience with this mental juxtaposition of our main character, is this inner part of the geometry, which runs in from the external before running back out again. An important phraseology here might be that the line must run through its own body in order to complete itself. The voice of Renton here is not used as address to the other and its laws. Typically, the Lacanian voice proceeds from the subject signification via the other signifiers that resides in the symbolic register. But this voice is addressed to the film's audience, not to Mark Renton's Princess Street, let alone the political world. It represents the potential within Renton to have the other's middle-class life with all its happy luxuries and ceremonial difficulties. Yet it serves to reflect who the audience might be, those who decide they have the surplus earnings to spend up to £15 on a movie ticket perhaps. In other words, certainly someone who identifies much more with the Choose Life monologue than our flighty Mark Renton. His imaginary inner world verbally remarks on the ideal political subject, yet the visuals say otherwise. Through the acquaintance of the imaginal and symbolic registers, Renton is presented to the audience as a fugitive, who appears to nonetheless feel his own wasted future inside. To Mobius, again, this reflects the logic of jouissance, an abundance of pleasure on running through oneself, contradicting oneself. For Hegel, we face semblance, both positive and negative movements of the knowing subject are mere semblance. The truth is in their sublimation into a peculiar whole. Now remarking on this Iggy Pop third register, the real, we hear the drums of Lust for Life as Renton's foot first hits the street pavement. The real is an ineffable register that does best to bring to light the imaginary and symbolic dynamics against it. Like the drums, the real rumbles as does the racing heartbeat of this anxious body. We can use our imagination to consider what it means for the line to strike through itself, a violent piercing that resounds like a thunderous drum. This is because the real marks the cut of the Mobius strip, its contradiction, its impossibility. However, Renton gains excess pleasure from this contradiction. Renton and Spud run down the steps from Leith Street to Carlton Road, where our former almost gets knocked over by a moving car. I really admire this moment, as Renton looks up to the audience. We sit in the car seat, looking at Renton via a windscreen. Thusly, we the audience are allowed to indulge in the mirror function of this mise en scène, as we sit behind this screen that Renton reflects off of. The loud crash is preceded by a delirious cackle, as the name of Renton appears on screen, freezing the frame. He obtains an excess enjoyment, lust for life, out of violence being reflected onto him in turn. All the while the rumbling reel of Iggy Pop beats its drums ever onwards, this reflection where inner, outer and reality collide on the cut, the beating drum. It is much the same in our preceding introductions for Tommy, Sick Boy, Begbie and Spud, as they all partake in a competitive game of footy. I surmise my argument here by pointing back to Renton's jouissance on the violent cut. The boys have their own respective vices that we come to understand more fully later on. Spud and Sick Boy also on heroin, Tommy in rough sex and a healthy dose of bodybuilding that nonetheless collapses into heroin, Begbie, who didn't do drugs, he just did people. Even if the last is most explicitly a member of this economy of violence, they all find themselves as the external world reflects violence in kind back onto them, simultaneously negating yet positing a narcissistic pleasure of the self's permanence. What is this all towards? Maintaining, pardon the pun, that hard economic border of inside and outside, the imaginal and symbolic that preserve themselves in fighting atop that dividing river or sea that is the real body. In his philosophy of right, Hegel even refers to rivers as equally capable of forming borders between national bodies, as much as invitations for bodies to improve through expansion, trade and interaction. However, This jouissance of cutting oneself off shows itself in its most bare form in Renton's slow heroin-induced fall to the ground, sequenced alongside his loss in the football game. He has successfully maintained his own hard border through violent identification. What the audience sees in this brief introductory encounter is encapsulated through the two audible voices in this scene again. The reel of Iggy Pop utters his lyrics, "He's gonna do another striptease," spoken but nonetheless pointing to a contradictory reality. That surplus pleasure felt in Renton's now revelatory erotic naked subjectivity on screen. And yet, we have Renton's monologue again.
Who needs reasons when you've got heroin?
Towards evaluating this cinematized dialectic, let's conclude with a purer philosophic point. There is no such thing as attaining truth, so to speak. Rather, in Zizek's apt explanation of the Hegelian movement, truth is found to have been there all along retroactively, like Freudian Nachträglichkeit. Renton's division is visible from the first scene, the juxtaposition of inner and outer worlds. As violence is immediately understood as negation of the positive work of the symbolic chain of political society, it is then retroactively negated a second time. As the line technically pierces itself twice in this same location, Renton violently negates the other. The first negation, only for the other to crash its negative windscreen onto him. The second. The second shows us the truth of Mark Renton. This contradictory geometry is now complete. Renton, delirious with reality, laughs. This is moving toward Hegel's doctrine of the concept, the idea of truth's emergence out of the semblance of positive and negative essence. What I hope to have illustrated in this dense psychophilosophic account of Mark Renton in Trainspotting is the appearance of twosomeness, that nonetheless becomes one through a real desire for contradiction itself. It is my hope that this topography invites one to consider their own psyche as they negotiate between semblant ideas of inner and outer.